Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Canassatego's speech at Lancaster from July 4th, 1744. Now, this is Canassatego's most famous speech today. It's the one that most people would recognize, and really it's recognizable for the last three paragraphs, which I will talk about. But I think that's really quite striking because most of the speech is not the last three paragraphs. It's a speech that is interesting and significant from the perspective of relations between indigenous peoples and the 13 colonies, the English colonies, particularly the middle colonies in the upper South. Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia are really the ones that Canassatego, those are the three sort of governors that Canassatego is talking to or about in terms of the treaty relationships between the Haudenosaunee, and Canassatego was a politician, diplomat, and rhetorician of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. He specifically was a member of the Onondaga Nation. And he had a lot of dealings with English colonial governments. And again, these speeches are, this speeches are addressed to the governors of Pennsylvania, whom he calls Brother Onus, the governor of Virginia, which is Brother Arasagoa, and the governor of Maryland, Takare Hogan, Brother Takare Hogan. And so this is a speech that really primarily is about the relationships between the Haudenosaunee and these different English colonial governments. That's primarily what it's about, right? And it starts with Canassatego acknowledging the current events that had been discussed the day before, and this is a thing with Haudenosaunee sort of political and diplomatic protocols. An important piece of information or proposal or something like that, you would wait until the next day to discuss it so that you had time to think it over, to rationalize, to sort of calmly assess, rather than giving a knee-jerk reaction that might be a mistake. So Canassatego starts out this speech addressing Brother Onus, again, the name the Haudenosaunee used for the governor of Pennsylvania, and this is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania, the state where I currently live. Canassatego, incidentally, as a Haudenosaunee, was from New York. The Onondaga lived in central New York. I grew up in western New York, in Seneca territory, historical Seneca territory, rather than Onondaga territory, but Haudenosaunee territory nonetheless, broadly conceived. So anyway, Canassatego starts out, Brother Onus, you were pleased yesterday to inform us that war had been declared between the great king of England and the French king, that two great battles had been fought, one by land and the other at sea, with many other particulars. So this is the start of what's called King George's War, which is based, the European equivalent of this was the War of Austrian Succession, I believe. And basically it was a war, the British and the French just used any excuse to go to war throughout the mid-18th century. And so from 1744 to 1748, there was King George's War, which is which is part of what in North America is called the French and Indian Wars. There's the French and Indian War fought between 1754, 1756, depending on when you start the date, in 1763. But there's a series of wars prior to this, right? King Philip's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, I think are the big three. And these pitted English and French against English and French against one another generally, but also against indigenous groups on each side. And so Canassatego starts this speech out basically being like, hey, you told us King George's War is starting. Cool, we're going to back you guys up, right? We are your friends. We are allies with the English. We will not let the French move through our territory. We will not let the French's indigenous allies move through our territory to attack you. Yeah, man, we're here for you. We're your allies. Plus, beyond that, even more so, we will use our power and influence over other indigenous groups, including indigenous people who have become Christians, and including other indigenous groups who are allies to the French. And we will try to prevent them from actively aiding the French in the war. So Canassatego clearly has a pretty substantial bargaining chip in diplomatic relations because the Haudenosaunee had a massive territory that they controlled by this point, right? The traditional homelands of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy are basically throughout what's now New York State. But by this time, their reach extended into New England, like Western Massachusetts, Connecticut, places like that. It extended down into Pennsylvania and even further south into what's now Virginia, West Virginia, like Northwest Virginia, West Virginia, out into Ohio. So the Haudenosaunee had a massive territory under their command. And while their governance system was not sort of an absolute system where they could like demand that the other nations under their vassalage is not exactly the right word, but the other nations under their influence and power do specific things, and they could enforce that. It didn't necessarily work that way, and we'll talk about Haudenosaunee government and governance in this video. They did nonetheless have substantial power and authority because they were militarily successful, right? So the fact that Canassatego is like, yeah, man, we're an incredibly powerful group. Our territory is located largely between the English colonies along the Atlantic coast and New France in what's now Quebec, Ontario, some of the maritime provinces, a little bit toward the prairies, right? So New France, the French territories in what's now Canada. The Haudenosaunee basically were between them, and they were a kind of buffer. And the Haudenosaunee, through Canassatego, were basically like, yeah, we're going to stop the French attacking you guys. He does also sort of say, we'd prefer that you didn't, show up and have battles in our territory. But yeah, and the thing is, Canassatego isn't just saying this to be kind. This is diplomatic relations that Canassatego is engaged in. He is engaged in negotiations with the English colonists. And slightly later on, he goes on, he's talking to the governor of Virginia, Brother Asaragoa, and what he says is, you told us yesterday that all disputes with you being now at an end, you desired to confirm all former treaties between Virginia and us, and to make our chain of union as bright as the sun. We very heartily agree with you in these propositions. We thank you for your good inclinations. We desire you will pay no regard to any idle stories that may be told to our prejudice. And as the dispute about the land is now entirely over and we perfectly reconciled, we hope for the future we shall not act toward each other, but as becomes brethren and hearty friends. And the note here from the editors of the Broadview Anthology of American Literature, and you can actually read this speech online. The Broadview has this Interestingly enough, this is, again, Canasatego's most famous speech, and Broadview has this as an online resource, whereas in the print copy of the anthology, they only have his speech from June 26th, which is really interesting, and I've made a video about that, but it isn't his most famous one, right? But the note from the Broadview editors here says, in 1722, the Haudenosaunee and the Virginia colony had signed a treaty specifying the Blue Ridge Mountains as the border between Virginia and Haudenosaunee territory. So Virginia to the east, Haudenosaunee territory to the west. Despite the treaty, white settlers soon began crossing the Blue Ridge into the Shenandoah Valley to the west in 1743. These encroachments led to skirmishing between settlers and Haudenosaunee. The negotiations at Lancaster were held in part to resolve this incipient conflict, and as part of the resulting treaty, the Haudenosaunee agreed to sell Virginia all territory claimed by them in the Shenandoah. So this is diplomacy, but it's diplomacy rooted in European settlers, English settlers, are encroaching on lands that, by treaty, belong to the Haudenosaunee. This, of course, would go on to be a major theme in Indigenous U.S. relations and Indigenous Canadian relations, right? Canassatego is pointing this out in 1744. But it's also, again, worth noting, he is a master rhetorician. He points this out. He draws attention to this conflict just after having said, yeah, we're going to back you guys up in King George's War. You're going to war with the French. We will support you through our territorial integrity, by preventing the French coming to attack you through our territory. We will be your ally. And then he turns to the governor of Virginia and says, now that we've settled this problem of your people encroaching on our territory, guaranteed to us by a treaty that you signed, we can go on. And again, toward the end of this speech, he makes another sort of reference to the encroachment of settlers and the ways in which the emergence of settlers within Haudenosaunee territory is straining their access to resources, et cetera, right? So all of this is going on. And all of this is really interesting, and it's important in terms of understanding the history of the Haudenosaunee, specifically the history of the middle colonies and the upper South, again, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia. It's important in terms of understanding the broader history of the treatment of indigenous people in settler colonial nations like what would become the United States and Canada. But the reason that Canassatego's July 4th, 1744 speech is his most famous, again, has to do with the last three paragraphs. Now, strikingly, it is a kind of bizarre historical accident that Canassatego gives this speech on July 4th, because 32 years later, July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress would sign the Declaration of Independence. And the reason that this speech is famous is because some people argue, and I think quite rightly, that this speech helped set the foundations for what would become the American Republic. So the last three paragraphs here are really where this happens. What Canassatego says is, we have one thing further to say, and that is we heartily recommend union and a good agreement between you and our brethren. Never disagree, but preserve a strict friendship for one another, and thereby you as well as we will become the stronger. Our wise forefathers established union and amity between the 5 nations. This has made us formidable. This has given us great weight and authority with our neighboring nations. We are a powerful confederacy, and by your observing the same methods our wise forefathers have taken, you will acquire fresh strength and power. Therefore, whatever befalls you, never fall out with one another. So these three paragraphs in which Canassatego proposes unity, proposes the colonists coming together and standing as one, and is worth pointing out, standing as one with the Haudenosaunee, which does not actually end up happening long term. The argument is often made, and I think quite a good historical basis for this, that Canassatego's speech plays a galvanizing role in setting the stage for the American Republic that would be declared following independence. What's the basis for this? One very immediate practical thing. The person who transcribed and printed these speeches was a cat you might have heard of if you know anything about the founding of the United States. He was a guy named Benjamin Franklin, or Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was one of the most important of the founding fathers in terms of conceptualizing what the anticipated United States should look like, what its values should be, how it should approach the world. And so Ben Franklin was here in 1744 when Canassatego gave this speech. He would have heard this brilliant orator say, "We are strong because we are united. We stand together, and you should as well if you want to be strong." I think it was Ben Franklin who would later design and draw the famous join or die, or he would design and print the famous join or die icon, which became a sort of symbol of the revolution. Became a symbol of uniting the colonies to preserve their rights, right? So this idea of unity as a form of power clearly had some influence on Franklin. Even if he was already thinking about that, it's hard to imagine that he heard Canassatego make this speech, make this argument, with all of the power that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy wielded in 1744, and Franklin would not have said, "Yeah, that's fucking smart. That guy is right. We should do that." Hard to make that argument that Franklin would not have come to that conclusion. So we have that element of it. The other element that people often point to is that so traditionally in a very sort of white supremacist Eurocentric way, the sort of foundational inspiration that people pointed to for the American Republic was Rome, the Roman Republic. I mean, we take the word Senate from Rome, right? Senate was the governing democratic body in ancient Rome. There's a problem with this, though. There's a problem with this conceptualization that the American government is founded on the Roman model, which is that the American Republican model doesn't really resemble the Roman Republican model. Rome had a Senate, and to the extent that the Roman Senate was largely made up of people with social power, that it was largely... It was not a democratic or really it was representative in the idea that under the doctrine of civic virtue, those who were sent to the Senate were meant to represent the interests of the people of Rome in general, but it was not democratic in the sense that the vast majority of Romans had no say over who went to the Senate. And so in that sense, the U.S. Senate was originally like that, right? It wasn't until the 18th Amendment, I want to say. I can't remember which one it was. I think it was the 18th Amendment, though, that established direct election of senators rather than the older system of basically state governments can appoint senators however they want, right? So so we have that element of it. Other than that, there's very, very little about the US system that aligns with the Roman Republican system. Rome didn't have a bicameral legislature. It didn't have a Supreme Court. It didn't have direct election of any person functioning in the government the way that we've always had through the House of Representatives and would come to have in the Senate later on. It didn't have a president, right? So the system looked completely different, and it didn't have sort of tiered governance of federal, state, local. So the Roman Republican system was quite different than the system that would come to exist in the U.S. But especially in that sort of tiered governance structure and the separation of powers, there's a strong model in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was actually, I would argue, and I think most people who've studied it would argue, was much more democratic than the system set up by the American founders. In the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, basically, political decisions were made where the issue would be discussed at the local level, probably on a clan level. So each nation was made up of clans, and then the Confederacy was made up of the 5 to 6 tribes, depending on which portion of Haudenosaunee history we're talking about, right? So clans would discuss issues, and they would discuss them openly and democratically. Everybody was entitled to speak. I'm not sure exactly whether that extended to children. I'm slightly unclear about that, but my sense is that basically everybody means everybody. And these would tend to be run under matriarchal authority. And so a decision would be made locally, and then that would be represented to the nation. So Canassatego was an Onondaga, so the clans of the Onondaga would each make their own decision about an issue, and then they would send a representative to the nation, the Onondaga nation, and then they would discuss, those representatives would discuss and represent their clan's perspective on things, etc., etc. And then the nation would say, all right, this is what we as a group have decided through a process of and these were all discursive democracy, basically. So the idea was like, we want to create universal assent. We want everyone to agree, everyone to be willing to accept the decision that's being made. And I'll come back to that in just a second. And then the representatives of each nation, the Onondaga, the Oneida, Cayuga, Seneca, and Mohawk, and then later the Tuscarora, they would come together into the Confederation government. Representatives would come together, and they would do the same thing, right? Representatives would discuss, they would represent their nations and the clans' interests, perspectives, views, they would make arguments, they would debate, they would discuss, with the objective of creating consensus. That's sort of what happens in the US. It's not exactly, right? Because we have local government, we have state governments, and we have the national government. And each of these has tiers of power and scopes of authority, things that they are responsible for, things they can do, things they can't do. And that system looks more like the tiered governance of the Haudenosaunee, even though it doesn't work in the same way, right? Like, so I live in the borough of Bellefonte. I live in Benner Township within the borough of Bellefonte, right? The overlaps of political entities in Pennsylvania I find slightly confusing, right? But the borough of Bellefonte does not sort of bring together all Bellefontians to discuss an issue and then send a representative to, say, Center County to represent our perspective on an issue, right? And then Center County doesn't send a representative to the Pennsylvania state government in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. the Pennsylvania state government doesn't then sort of pass things up the chain of command, right? It doesn't exactly work that way, but we do have tiered governance that separates powers between local control and federal control, state control, whatever it is, right? So we have that set up for that reason. It's part of the checks and balances structure that was created as part of the U.S. Constitution. But again, there's no model for that in the Roman Republic, really. It just doesn't happen in Rome, but it happens in what would become New York with the Haudenosaunee. And so a lot of people have pointed to this tiered government structure, this speech, and actually a number of other references made by the founders of the U.S. Republic, suggesting that they were looking at the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, they were looking at indigenous forms of government and saying, what can we learn from this? What can we take from this? So we've got all of that stuff, right? Now, the one thing that I think is really, the one major difference that I would point out that I think makes Haudenosaunee governance substantially better than what the U.S. would build is that the Haudenosaunee did not have a majority rules system. They sought to create consensus, but if consensus could not be created, then they would go with the viewpoint on an issue that had gotten the most support. But if your particular group did not agree to abide by that decision, you were not bound by it. So if the Haudenosaunee decided on a particular course of action, they were going to sign a particular treaty, say, with the governor of Maryland, and the Seneca were like, we think this is a big mistake. We don't want to sign this. Then the Haudenosaunee weren't forced to. They had the freedom to opt out of decisions that were made if they were not consensus-made decisions, right? So I think that's a really, really good element of Haudenosaunee government that the U.S. doesn't have, right? If the federal government makes a terrible decision that the state of Pennsylvania is like, we really wish you hadn't done this, we don't want this, the state of Pennsylvania has limited power to not be bound by that decision, right? So we've got all of that. The other thing, and this is a sort of smaller thing, the first U.S. government was formed under the Articles of Confederation. The Haudenosaunee famously were a confederacy. So that's the other sort of thing that people point to in terms of the influence of the Haudenosaunee on the American Republic. But again, Canassatego's July 4th, 1744 speech at Lancaster, super, super important and super, super influential on the founding of the United States, which is having its 250th birthday today.